Hello, my dear friends, and welcome. I'm very excited because I have a special guest for today's video. I have Dr. Brandon Beaber. He is a board-certified neurologist and specialty training in multiple sclerosis and other immunological diseases of the nervous system. He's also author and a fellow YouTuber. We're going to chat today about YouTube, MS diets, resilience, and MS. Welcome, Dr. Beaber.
Thank you for having me, Vickie.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad that we get to spend some time together. So tell me, what prompted you to start a YouTube channel?
Well, I come from the generation of doctors that when I was in medical school, social media was thought of very differently. We thought you should stay away from it. It's going to ruin your career. People applying to medical school were afraid even to have private Facebook profiles because they thought the admissions committees would see them and not like it. But things have really changed over the years. So I was definitely not involved in social media at all early in my career. I actually first started in Twitter. One of my patients told me that, there are a lot of doctors on Twitter and you should check it out. And I actually checked it out and I thought it was very educational. You see articles coming out about MS and you see it right away, and commentary from various experts and some insight for people with MS that kind of give their own personal experience. And it was just a really lively educational experience. And, there were some things that were limiting about Twitter where you only have a certain number of characters. So it's great for posting links and short commentaries, but you can't really create something cohesive, like talking about a broader topic or various side effects of a medication all at once. And so I made a few YouTube videos. I had no intention of doing it on a regular basis, and I had great reservation about doing it. And Dr. Boster, who's a great MS YouTuber, he gave me a call and he was so excited. He was saying, "Oh, those videos were great. You got to keep making more." I was trying to get other neurologists to do this. And he gave me some tips like how to make thumbnails, which is the little picture you see when you click on the video, and the titles and the notes and little things about video editing. And, I got addicted to it. And as I'm sure you would agree, it's very addictive to be a content creator, seeing the response and wanting to make more and more videos. I have a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, it is addictive. I started about 3 years ago, and I've been following both you and Dr. Boster for some time. And I really love that doctors and neurologists are getting on YouTube because, as you know, we have limited time with our doctors when we have visits, and their schedules are usually pretty tight. And this long form content where you can dive deep into a topic that's relevant to us is so very helpful. So we really appreciate it. You've done several videos on MS diets, different diet protocols that support people with MS. Do you have a favorite, and why is it your favorite?
Well, I find, like, from a practical perspective, it helps to give someone something. When I have a patient in my exam room, if I sort of pontificate on various studies and philosophies about diet, that's not going to be very helpful. So I do give people in the clinic specific information, and I give advice similar to what's in the Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis protocol and kind of a summary of the book by Professor George Jelinek. And this is primarily based on epidemiologic evidence, basically that in countries where people consume more saturated fat and dairy, there seem to be higher rates of MS and that type of research. But my overall opinion is that there's not really a single definitive diet proven to be the best for MS. If you look at randomized controlled trials, which is the best evidence, it's really not so clear. For instance, Dr. Terry Walls, who promotes a paleo diet, she had a great publication called the WAVE study, comparing her diet, which is like a modified paleo diet, to the Swank diet, which is a low saturated fat diet. And they're very different. Dr. Walls really advocates for saturated fat, coconut oil, red meats, although grass-fed meats. So they're very different diets. And if anything, there was a slight trend in her favor. So it's not so clear, but in terms of the advice I give to my patients based on what I would consider to be best available evidence, essentially OMS.
That's great.
I'm sure you would like that, given given your involvement with it. Share it.
Yes, yes. I will put links up above and in the description below to Dr. Beaver's channel, and also links to an interview he did with me recently. I won a contest that he ran, and the winnings went to the Overcoming MS organization. And I am a fan of Overcoming MS, but I've studied all the diets as well. You know, on my bookshelf, you can see I have quite a few of them. And, you know, one thing that I have found that they all have in common is they're real food, they're whole foods. You know, it gets rid of all the processed, excuse me, all the processed foods and the sugars and artificial and chemicals. So, you know, all the diets can be helpful to people with MS, don't you think?
I think absolutely. I mean, just the elimination of processed foods and eating more whole foods. The reason that I actually got involved with OMS is because my ambition originally was there's no good MS diet book out there. I'm going to read all of them, do my own research, and I'm going to write my own. That was honestly my plan. But when I read Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis, it was such a good book. And, you know, good for me, not necessarily for someone with MS. I mean, it's pretty technical. There are hundreds of citations, but it was extremely well done and well researched. And I thought, you know, this is better than what I could do. And so I kind of gave up on my plan to write the book and started sort of endorsing those principles. But I definitely agree with you that 90% of the benefit may just be eliminating processed foods and eating a healthier diet overall with more whole foods rather than having a highly specific plan.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of writing books, you did write a book that's really awesome called Resilience in the Face of Multiple Sclerosis. And again, I'll put a link above and in the description below. You can get that book free on Kindle, and you can also order the paperback. Can you talk a little bit about the topic of resilience and how it can help people with MS despite having this disease?
Yeah, the reason that I wrote that book is, you know, early on in my experience, I noticed that a lot of people with MS, even if they have a lot of physical problems, and even if they have a lot of invisible problems like fatigue and pain, a surprisingly high percentage of people with MS really do live great lives, and they're very productive and very happy people. And I specifically interviewed people who had more disability. You know, so if you read the book, it focuses on people who have a lot of physical disability. And I sort of interviewed them about how they were able to live such an amazing life. These are people who inspired me, my own patients. And, you know, they all did different things. I wouldn't say there's one specific thing that they all did. And resilience is more of a process than a trait. It's not something that you were born with. It's forged over time through your experiences. One thing I learned is that we have this bias that some people are just tougher than others and they can just handle things. But the reality is a lot of those patients that I interviewed, they actually had a difficult time at the beginning. They may have been very depressed and discouraged and hopeless, but they really improved over time. So if you're newly diagnosed with MS or going through a difficult time, don't become discouraged. I think one thing that they had in common is they were generally hopeful and optimistic people. You know, if you're a 30-year-old newly diagnosed with MS with a relatively low amount of disability, I don't think it's helpful to think about the worst case scenario. You know, certainly no one can predict how you would be in 30 years, but a surprising number of people with MS for decades do pretty well. So I think it's better to be optimistic and to live your life the way that you want to live it and to face challenges later on. You know, the other thing I thought these people had is that they were very adaptive. They were willing to make a change if they had to. One example is Sandra Roscoe, who is the title of one of the chapters of the book, and that's her real name with permission. She had fairly aggressive multiple sclerosis. She was an ambitious woman. She worked as a healthcare administrator, but because of her disability, she had a lot of pain and physical disabilities and mobility limitations. She really wasn't able to work, and she lost her career as a healthcare professional. And she was profoundly depressed at that time. She was even admitted to an inpatient psychiatric facility at one point. She was distinctively not resilient in that moment. But over years, she sort of rebuilt her life. She actually became very politically active. She started going to city council meetings, learning different people's names, and started to have a lot of influence. And she did a lot of great things for the city. One thing that you probably haven't heard of if you're not from the Los Angeles area is the City of Bell scandal, which is in 2010. There was this huge scandal very close to where I am right now. I'm in Downey, California, South LA, where the city administrators were stealing money from the taxpayers. And she and others helped to speak out against that and uncover that, and they all got arrested. And that's just one of the many great things that she did. And, you know, that's just one example of how someone is able to face adversity, change what their priorities are in life, and move on to have a good and happy life. And, you know, she's one of the happiest people I've ever met. She just has an incredible, infectious smile, never complaining. And she really has a lot of problems. And it's not that she stopped her MS. You know, she has progressive MS and uses a wheelchair and has a lot of problems, but she lives a great life despite MS.
That's awesome. Yeah, there are 5 stories of different people in the book, and they're all very unique individuals, and they all have unique ways of being resilient with their MS. But one thing that I found as I was reading the book is they all seem to either have a sense of purpose or find a new sense of purpose. One of them was a doctor, and she developed MS in her residency. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
But her sense of purpose was to be a doctor. So she just dealt with the MS so she could go on with her purpose of being a doctor. And yeah, I found that fascinating that they all had different purposes in their life.
Yeah, completely different purposes.
Yeah. In one chapter of the book, you write about the philosophy of Hooponopono. And as I understand it, it's the practice of putting things to right or putting them back in order. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
The way I found out about this was from Mabel Katz, who's like an expert in Hooponopono. Pronunciation is very difficult there. You know, and she was just such a vibrant, powerful person that she was the kind of person where she must know something that I don't know. I had actually never heard of this philosophy before meeting her. And it's this Hawaiian philosophy that relates to communication and self-realization. And there's no way I could talk about all of it. There are a lot of different aspects of it. One concept that Mabel has is the idea of 100% responsibility. Now, you can't control everything that happens to you in life. You can't control getting multiple sclerosis, obviously, but you can control a lot of how you react things to in life. So, for instance, if something happens and you get angry or you get scared, you can sort of think about that and try to control your reaction to things and control how you think about things. And they're all kind of mantras that she tells people to say, like, thank you and I love you. And you're supposed to kind of systematically replace your negative thoughts and emotions with positive thoughts and emotions. And there are all kinds of little tricks that she has to have like this positive, optimistic attitude and take responsibility for how you feel and to control how you feel in the world. You know, it's hard to talk about everything. There are all kinds of different styles about it. She's Spanish speaking, and she's very well known in Spanish speaking countries where Hooponopono is popular. So her brand is a little bit different than maybe the mainstream Hawaiian brand, but it is very interesting.
Yeah, I found it fascinating. Do you have any tips that you can share with the viewers on building resilience or practicing resilience?
Well, you kind of alluded to it earlier in finding meaning. You know, one of the schools of psychology that I like is what's called positive psychology. One of the kind of criticisms of psychology in general is that it's really focused on disease like depression and anxiety or schizophrenia. And there wasn't really a lot of research in psychology to kind of help the everyday person with usual problems. And so this well-known psychologist, Martin Seligman, he studied this topic. What makes ordinary people happy, productive, and have good relationships? And he kind of studies different forms of happiness. Now, one of these forms of happiness is just positive emotion, what you might call simple pleasure or hedonism, like eating chocolate fudge or watching a comedy show. It is happiness, but it's very temporary. You only experience the happiness while you have that experience, and it goes away very quickly. Also, it's very tolerizing. In other words, once you're used to something, it doesn't give you as much happiness anymore, just like, taking a drug, for instance. So if you're used to eating steaks at Morton's, well, now if you eat a steak at Norm's, it's not going to taste as good. I don't know if there is a Norm's on the East Coast, but
there is not, but I understand.
But you get the idea. So it's not necessarily the route to long-term happiness. Now, he talks about other forms of happiness. One of them is engagement, and that's the idea of being engrossed in an activity. It could be your work. It could be a hobby, like if you're really into knitting or chess or singing, where it just kind of takes up your time, and time moves quickly when you're doing it. And that can be a form of happiness. And let's say you have MS, and because of your disabilities, you're not able to work. Try to find something else that really takes up your time and engages you and distracts you. And the other thing that he mentions, which you alluded to earlier, is having a sense of purpose or a sense of meaning. So maybe my sense of meaning is to, work hard and try to be a good doctor and take care of my patients, but yours might be something else. It might be through your own work or through a charity organization or through a hobby or spreading the arts or whatever it might be, or taking care of your family. And just try to find a sense of purpose and meaning. And if MS forces you to lose one sense of purpose, try to look for something else. And it may take you months or years to find that. But in the long run, if you look at the people that I interviewed, they all sort of had that. Like you said, they all had a purpose in life, a reason to keep going. And, he talks about a few other things like having good relationships with people. Often there are certain things that even if they're very expensive, like a luxury vacation or, luxury item like a fancy purse or show or whatever, doesn't necessarily give you a lot of happiness, but having strong relationships with friends and family, which is ultimately free, is much more important. But you have to invest in those relationships. You have to take time. You have to, really do what other people want to do sometimes. It doesn't necessarily come easily and automatically, particularly as you get older. And the last thing is achievement, having like a sense of accomplishment, doing things to be proud of. And so, maybe if you're not able to work, you don't get as much sense of achievement through that. You could do something else. Maybe there's a hobby that you excel in, or something else creative that you can do that you can be proud of.
Those are excellent tips. And I agree with all of them. Having that sense of purpose and happiness and mindfulness, the relationship part. I think a lot of times when people are diagnosed with MS, they don't know anyone who has MS. And they start looking for support groups. They say birds of a feather flock together. And, there's purpose in that. We can support each other through groups. I'm an OMS ambassador, an Overcoming MS ambassador, and we have circles, the name for their support groups. And being together with these people, we support each other. And it's really helpful to have that sense of purpose, and helping others just brings joy.
Yeah, you reminded me of a famous study that was done. I don't remember the exact details of it, but it was something about providing emotional support to people. So some people were randomized to receive emotional support, and other people were randomized to give emotional support. So they would call the other people and kind of encourage them. And everyone benefited in the study. But interestingly, the people who were doing the help, they were doing the charity, they seemed to benefit more than the people who were receiving the service. So it truly is better to give than to receive sometimes.
It is. It really is. I can 100% agree. Whenever I'm feeling down or struggling, I think about how I can volunteer or work on one of the projects that I work on that helps others, and it always lifts my spirits. So on to more clinical topics. Are you involved in any studies or trials right now? And can you share any information on them?
Well, one thing that I'm peripherally involved with is the study on ATA188, which is a drug that's being developed. It's an immune therapy by Ataro Biotherapeutics that targets Epstein Barr Virus, which is likely part of the cause of MS. And it does have a phase 1 study that looks good, but it's still very early on. And there's an ongoing study where it's being studied in people with progressive multiple sclerosis. And it's a randomized trial, drug versus placebo. And this is being done at Kaiser Los Angeles Medical Center, which is about 20 miles from where I am. So I'm not directly doing it, but I'm technically the backup investigator. I don't have any insider knowledge of any preliminary data, but I certainly think that is an interesting drug because we may be targeting something very different from our immunotherapies.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I saw an article just earlier this year on the phase 1 trials, and it looks really promising.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we all understand that we need something different. Not everyone needs a strong immunosuppressant and not everyone benefits from them. There's a different aspect of the disease we need to focus on. And so that's very interesting. One thing that I'm working on is kind of related to overcoming multiple sclerosis. They've done a lot of great cross-sectional studies, the holism research studies, and they have a lot of great publications, but there's not a lot of focus on people who are older with multiple sclerosis who've had MS for a longer period of time. And so what I want to look at is nutrition and lifestyle factors in people with MS over age 55 and see, is there a correlation between having a certain diet, a certain vitamin D level, smoking, and long-term disability? Because if you look at 30-year-olds with MS, most of them look pretty good, and there's not necessarily a huge amount of variation of disability, except for an unlucky small number of people who have more aggressive MS. But if you look at people who've had MS for 30 years who are older, some of them do have significant disability, but some of them are doing quite well. Is there a difference between these two groups? It's just an observational study, but hopefully we can learn something. I'm actually doing it with the University of Melbourne team, George Jelinek, Steve Simpson, Sandra Neat, but there's some technical difficulties, a lot of paperwork to fill out. So we're still working on that. If only I could clone myself, it would be done a lot faster.
I bet. I would love to see 2 Dr. Beavers. You'd get a lot more done. Fascinating that you're working with Dr. Jelinek and the team in Australia. I look forward to seeing what you guys find out.
That may be years away. That may be years away, to give you fair warning.
Yes. Are there any new or exciting things coming out in treatments that you see coming besides the ATA 188?
Yeah, ATA 188 may be a little longer away. The new class of medications that may come relatively soon, like within a few years, would be the Bruton Tyrosine Kinase inhibitors. And so, it's well known that a class of drugs that are highly effective in multiple sclerosis are drugs that kill B cells, B lymphocells sites, the cells that make antibodies, drugs such as Ocrevus, rituximab, Kesimpta. But these drugs do have undesirable side effects. They can cause infections. I have quite a few relatively young, healthy patients who got bad COVID-19 pneumonia as a side effect of these medications. And so there's this other class of medications, Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, that block this enzyme, BTK or Bruton's tyrosine kinase, that is involved in immune cell signaling. And it's not as potent as an immunosuppressive. It's probably quite a bit safer, particularly for older people with progressive MS who may have a greater risk of getting infections. And also these medications have some specific effects on certain types of immune cells that are part of the innate immune system. And so we know that primarily multiple sclerosis is driven by the adaptive immune system, T and B cells. But it turns out that within the central nervous system, there's some low-level smoldering inflammation driven by the innate immune system, such as microglia and macrophages. And there seems to be some effect on these cells of the BTK inhibitors. These are drugs like tolebrutinib and evobrutinib, and we'll see how effective they are. And hopefully they'll provide an effective, safe option for people with progressive MS.
Oh, that's very exciting. One of my MS buddies that I talked to today might be able to get into a clinical trial for that. He unfortunately has an active lesion, and that's one of the prerequisites is they're looking for people with active lesions so they can test it out. Thanks so much for that information. That's really exciting. Do you have any other final thoughts to share with our viewers?
Well, one thing I would say going back to the lifestyle is, even if a diet doesn't work, it works anyway. So let's say it turns out that there's really no specific diet that is beneficial in multiple sclerosis. It's still highly likely that eating a diet abundant in whole fruits and vegetables and devoid of processed food and exercising regularly and doing things to relieve your stress and get adequate sleep is going to help your overall health. And, even if it doesn't directly benefit multiple sclerosis, it will very likely benefit you in terms of your overall health. A lot of people who get side effects of medication, they're not just related to the medication, they're related to a combination of the medication plus other medical conditions. Just to give one example, like with Gilenya, the side effect of macular edema or swelling of the back of the eye is much more common in people with diabetes. So if you don't have diabetes, you're less likely to get that side effect.
Yes.
If you're taking an immunosuppressant, but you're fairly healthy overall, you're less likely to get a severe infection. So you really can't lose by improving your lifestyle one way or the other. You don't have to get tied up with the idea that something has to be definitively proven. We don't really need class 1A evidence, multiple randomized controlled trials to recommend broccoli and exercise.
That's true. That's true. I often tell my viewers that getting MS is not our fault, but taking care of our health is our responsibility. So eat your vegetables, exercise, get good sleep, practice mindfulness, and take really exquisite care of yourselves. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm going to put links up above and in the description below. You can reach out. You can see Dr. Beaber's videos on his YouTube channel and order his book on Amazon. And thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, the like icon under the video. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Until next time, be well.
Take care, Vickie.